Welcome to End of Life University on YouTube. In this video, I'm sharing with you a conversation I had with Travis Rieder, who is a bioethicist at Johns Hopkins University. And we talk all about ethical dilemmas around decision making at the end of life. And this is such an important conversation. It's challenging, but something we all need to think about and be aware of. And Travis, in particular, discusses a personal dilemma that he and his family faced. So I think you'll find it very interesting, as I did. And before you go, be sure to click subscribe below for this channel if you haven't yet subscribed. Also, be sure to subscribe or follow the podcast wherever you happen to listen to podcasts. That's End of Life University as well. And if you would like to help support this YouTube channel and the podcast and keep us on the air, you can make a small contribution that will actually make a huge difference by going to eoluniversity.com/support to find out 3 different ways that you can contribute and keep us going on the air. And as always, I appreciate all your ratings and reviews. So we'll get going with the interview with Travis Rieder. Today, I'm so happy to welcome my guest, Travis Rieder. Travis is the Assistant Director for Education Initiatives, Director of the Master of Bioethics degree program, and Associate Research Professor at the Johns Hopkins Berman Institute of Bioethics. An author and TED Talk speaker, his most recent book is In Pain, a bioethicist's personal struggle with opioids. Today, though, we'll be talking about an essay Travis wrote for the Johns Hopkins Online Hub titled A Father's Wish, a Bioethicist's Dilemma, which I found particularly compelling, and I think you'll be interested in hearing this story. So you can learn more about Travis and his work at his website, which is travisrieder, RIEDER.com. So Travis, thanks for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, and congratulations on getting through the mouthful that is that bio. All the time, Johns Hopkins loves titles.
Yeah. Phew. I was worried that I was going to stumble in the middle of it, but I just barely made it. Well, you are the first bioethicist I've ever spoken to on this podcast, so I'm really interested to learn more about your work. I mean, I have an idea of what I think bioethicists do, but I'd love to hear from you a little bit more about the kinds of cases you get involved in, and particularly around end of life issues, since that's what my audience is interested in.
Yeah, of course. So bioethics is a somewhat new term. Folks might be more familiar with medical ethics or biomedical ethics, but even the field as a whole is pretty young in North America. So North American bioethics started in the 70s, 60s, 70s, and it was really born out of atrocity. It was born out of terrible human subjects experimentation, like the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. It was born out of a recognition that physicians were often seen as paternalistic gatekeepers of not only medications but information. Don't tell her she has cancer. She's a woman. She'll be hysterical. So sexist, misogynistic, hierarchical, but also just paternalistic sort of role. And so over the 60s, 70s, and the decades since, there was a development of a field specifically designed to address difficult questions in biomedicine. So that started out as clinical medicine and research from these sorts of difficulties. The field that I work in, bioethics, sees itself as bigger than that now. And so some of my colleagues who did the work late 90s, early 2000s, saying, not all interesting ethical questions are about clinical medicine or about research. Some of them are about public health, right? We have to decide, say, in a pandemic, is it justified to issue lockdown orders? Those are hugely invasive of individual rights of movement, et cetera. But the cost of not doing it is measured in suffering and human lives. So how do we think about that? So public health ethics kind of blew up the space a little bit bigger. And some of the work that I do is really kind of on the margins of health-related ethics. So I think about climate change because it's a massive public health threat now and in the future. But it's a bit tangent. It's climate science, it's environmental ethics as well. So that's the big field. So I think about the ethics and policy questions raised by science, medicine, public health, and all the different ways that they intersect. Um, Largely, my intersection with end of life was very distant. As a teacher, as a professor, I would have to teach kind of standard biomedical ethics cases. And so very often you would teach end of life cases. And so you teach famous Karen Ann Quinlan case, and you teach questions about death with dignity as a movement, physician assisted suicide and active euthanasia. But that was never my specialty. So I worked in these big public health issues like climate change and sustainability. And then, as you noted, I have a book on opioids and addiction and drug overdose crisis. And that came about through a very personal experience I had with opioids. So I work on drugs, addiction, overdose. And so the end of life engagement that I had was deeply personal because it had to do with my dad. And I think what was striking about the experience for me is that as a bioethicist, I felt like I should have been prepared in some way. One of my jobs is to teach medical doctors how to think about ethics. And I used some of these cases, and then my dad was on life support and I had no idea what to do. It was so confounding. So my intersection was really quite limited. I was clearly a novice despite whatever I might have thought.
But I really think all of us become novices when we're in a personal situation, because even me as a hospice doctor, when my mom was dying and I went home to bring her home from the hospital and take care of her, I was a total novice. I felt so unprepared in spite of all this professional training, because it's a completely different situation when it's suddenly someone you love and you're in the position of making decisions on their behalf. It's a completely different realm in a way than what you're used to doing in your job.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, that was certainly my experience. And I was with my sister, who's a nurse, and my dad's wife, then fiance, who was also a career nurse. And so, like, two nurses and a bioethicist, you kind of felt like if anybody should have some preparation, maybe throw in a palliative care doctor and we should have had it all
We
covered.
yeah, two nurses and a bioethicist walk into an ICU. It's almost like well, I do want you. I mean, I would love for you to tell the whole story, because it's a very fascinating and compelling story of how one particular case evolved. But there's one thing I wanted to ask you about that I was really interested in, that I read on your website, which you wrote that you are attracted to preventable catastrophe. And so it seems as if we think of these end of life situations as preventable catastrophe. At least in my world, we're constantly telling people, plan ahead, know what you want for the end of life, keep your advance directives, talk about it, tell people what you want. And so would you talk about what preventable catastrophe means to you, and if you see that differently now?
Yeah, for sure. Yes and yes. So the reason that's on my website is because it kind of holds together a bunch of my interests, like climate change, like the drug overdose crisis in North America. And so I'm trained as a philosopher. I don't think I said that. So my PhD is in philosophy, and so I have a mind for puzzles. Philosophers are trained in logic, and so we're a little bit of gamers. And so when I find an ethically interesting case, it's very often because it presents itself as a puzzle to me. And so the puzzle of preventable catastrophe is that it's preventable and we let it happen anyway. And I see this just show up so many different places in our lives. And so with climate change, this should be very obvious, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
we could have been doing something for the last 30 or 40 years and we're just not. And now millions and millions of people are going to suffer and die as a result. The drug overdose crisis is such a striking example because we have all of the tools that we need to keep people from dying from their drug use and addiction. And especially in the United States, we just don't use them very well. We're bad at addiction treatment. We're very bad at harm reduction, and people die as a result. So I think it's interesting that you bring this up because I hadn't necessarily recognized that this new interest of mine that was very personally spurred really does have the same sort of structure to it, that we do tend to say people like to have control over the end of their lives. People want to die at home rather than in the hospital, right? We have all of these claims about how people want the end of their lives to go, and then it's just almost never the way it goes, right? We end up out without having control, highly medicalized in the ICU or in the hospital, and that's where we die. And so it is another sort of example of this puzzle that we could choose to do things a different way and we don't, and that's a sort of mystery of human nature in this instance. And so, boy, wouldn't it be great if we could solve some of that? That's that's an ambitious goal, but
Yeah,
yeah.
exactly. Well, if you don't mind, I'd love to just have you tell the audience the story and take as much time as you need, because there are a lot of like nuances here and a lot of factors to cover in terms of your father's story. So,
Yeah, absolutely. So I will. I'll tell it with some details, and if I forget some of them that struck you in the piece, feel free to prod me.
okay.
If I'm long-winded, you can just edit it out later. So this was right before the pandemic hit. So this was New Year's of about December 30, December 29, December 30th of 2019. So when the world was still more normal. And my father lived in Texas with his girlfriend, and I'm in Maryland. And so I got a call from my sister, who's a year and a half older than me, and she was hysterical on the phone. I had been actually out on a date with my wife. It was a really lovely night, and I saw that I'd missed two calls from my sister, and panicked and called her back. And she's crying and huffing and can't catch her breath. And she said, "It's dad, it's dad. I think he's dying. I think he might be dead." And
Wow.
I can't translate this in my head. And I said, "Sis, I need you to slow down and tell me what happened." She said, "Travis, Robin called. This is my dad's girlfriend. Robin called. I heard them shock him." And that's when I realized that something happened. EMTs must be there. And so we slowly gather ourselves to get the story. And all she knew at the time is that Robin had been able to call her once the EMTs arrived, because she'd been doing CPR before that. And so once the EMTs arrived, and they had in not Santa Fe, in whatever city they live in, which will come to me in a moment.
San
Um,
Antonio.
San Antonio, thank you.
Okay.
Yeah. In San Antonio, they happen to have one of the machines that does compressions for you. And so they got my dad into the machine, and it's jackhammering on his chest. And she called my sister and said, "Your father's heart stopped. I don't know why. He was making coffee. I was right by his side. As soon as he hit the ground, I started CPR. I swear I did my best, but he's being taken care of by the EMTs now, and that's as much as I know."
And Robin was a nurse, so she knew how to do CPR correctly. That's an important factor, I think.
It's a crazy sort of detail that not only is she a career nurse, who's clearly very skilled at CPR, she had just redone her certification, and so she had just been practicing and tested. And she was literally, so in her house, she was watching TV. The kitchen is right behind her. My dad was having a cold. He's kind of sick. He was sniffling around. He'd just gotten up to make coffee in the middle of the afternoon. And she watched him walk by. He said, "Do you want any coffee?" She said, "No, thanks." And then she heard a thump. And she said, "Brent," no sound. She kind of jumped up, just ran around the island. So 10 seconds, right? And she said he was purple when she got there. So she immediately started CPR. So the ambulance comes. They shock him, I think, a few times. They get a weak rhythm at some point, but by Robin's count, he was down for about 22 minutes, from the time he hit the floor until they found a weak rhythm. So they load him into the ambulance and take him to the hospital. So I, of course, get all of this later, secondhand, piecemeal. My sister lives in Indiana. I'm in Maryland. And so I say, "Can you leave tomorrow?" She has kids. I have a kid. She said, "Yeah, I'll make it happen. Just buy us tickets." And so we meet in Texas and go down there the next day. So um, I'd never met Robin, by the way. Interesting facts. So I
Mm.
meet her at the hospital for the first time. when we get down there, they started the Arctic Sun Protocol, which I'd never heard of before. I get down there.
Me either.
Yeah, okay. So they had induced hypothermia. So they have a machine that very slowly takes them down some, half a degree for so many hours. And so they induce mild hypothermia to try to slow brain damage. And what I find kind of philosophically fascinating, was not fascinating at the time, is we couldn't get there, till the next morning. And Robin had arrived at the hospital the night before. And so she'd later tell us, the attending said, it's time to let him go. He was down for a long time. His rhythm is weak. He's almost certainly not coming back. And if he is, he's not going to want to. And Robin just said, no, that's his kid's decision. Your job is to keep him alive. They're going to be here tomorrow. So what's fascinating is if they're going to keep him alive, they have to do everything as if they're going to be maximally aggressive, right? So they induce this hypothermic process. And so now he's on a train to hopeful recovery. So that by the time we get down there, we feel really like passengers, because what are you going to do? Tell him to stop now that things look better than they did when he first got to the hospital? Like, not, I mean, he's been alive for 24 hours, and that's presumably good news. So that was the first thing that I found sort of philosophically interesting, is that yes, we were supposed to be the ones to make a decision, but by the time we were in a position to make a decision, waiting for us was a decision, right? Because it was part of the care process.
Yeah, that's such a good point, that we come to these crossroads when something has to be done. Some kind of choice has to be made. And if the family isn't there or available, I guess they make the default decision that we have to keep the patient alive because we don't know what the family will choose. We have to be aggressive in our choices since we don't know what they might want or what their father had expressed to them he wanted. So, yeah, but as you said, the train has already left the station by the time you get there. How do you change that, and how do you intervene in that situation?
Yeah, so the point about his wishes is then the next sort of important piece is that, I say in the essay that my dad was a morbid man, is what we used to always say to him. But um he has a dark sense of humor, and but he was adamant, he had firm commitment, he never wanted to be kept alive, not himself. So that was the sort of language he used, and probably some less politically correct, like, we probably would say, don't keep me alive as a vegetable or something, don't keep my body alive for the sake of keeping my body alive. Like, if I can be me, yes. If I can't be me, pull the plug, right? Let me go. And I mean, he started telling us this when we were like kids, like small kids, right? And so this is a well-established fact in my family. My sister and I share this realization. And so now we feel a little bit haunted, right? Because we show up in San Antonio to this situation where they have chosen to keep him alive. And we're thinking, oh my God, if we had been the ones to show up at the hospital and the physician, the person who's supposed to know, had said he's not coming back as himself, we would have cried and said, then take him off life support, right? Um, but because we didn't, now we're stuck in this position where he's in this long-term process. So the Arctic Sun Protocol is you induce mild hypothermia, you try to stabilize the patient, you figure out everything that you can about their general health, whatever's failing, and then you rewarm them up and eventually try ventilator trials and stuff to see how they are. And this is like a 5-day process or something. And so we get there in the ICU at the middle of day 2, thinking we should have said no thanks yesterday. And because we didn't, are we going to tell them to withdraw support now? That didn't seem right. And they were collecting information. They were on this aggressive train, right? Every doctor that came in, I mean, you're a physician, so like the rounding is a crazy experience in the ICU because he has like 7 physicians and we don't even understand who all is doing what. And they'd come in and chirpily say, well, his kidneys seem to be doing fine. Well, his lungs seem to be doing fine. So like everything's great except the fact that he's trying to die.
They're each looking at a different machine and writing down the numbers that apply to the organ they specialize in, and everyone's giving you all this fragmented information about how he's doing.
Yeah. Yeah. So I would say the middle of that first week was the worst part because Robin is new to the family. She's still just the girlfriend at that point. They've been living together, but um, she was looking at a future together that she was suddenly worried about losing. And so very reasonably, she's kind of most like, come on, give him a chance, right? Um, but my sister and I are being haunted by a lifetime of our dad telling us, don't do this thing to me. And now we kind of find ourselves without wanting to be doing this thing to him, right? Like we're in charge, we're the proxies, but it doesn't feel right at any moment to say stop now, right? Like what's special about now, right?
And it's interesting that you did have the benefit of knowing so clearly exactly what your dad wanted, which so many families in that situation do not know. They don't have the information, they've never discussed it, so they have no idea what their loved one would want or might choose. So it was good that you knew what he wanted, but therefore you were haunted because what he would have wanted wasn't happening. And yet, how could you intervene at that point to make a change?
Yeah, and so that's really important because part of what we were haunted by is not actually knowing what he wanted, despite him being so clear about his wishes, right? And so he had said all these things that had seemed so easy to us, right? Like, don't keep my body alive if my brain is gone, don't keep me alive if I'm not me. That all sounded fine in the abstract, but now we're in the messy world where everything's radically uncertain, right? And so we ask every physician who comes in, like, what's his prognosis? And they're all reasonably saying, we're kind of not there yet. Like we're trying to figure out if he's going to actively die. We're trying to figure out what happened to his heart. They actually didn't know. So it turned out that it wasn't a heart attack. They couldn't find any muscle damage, and so I think it ends up being called a lethal arrhythmia. It was an electrical problem. So there was just like a bunch of like problem solving to do, and we needed to know what's the probability that he comes back not as himself, because that's the thing we need to avoid. And that's a piece of information we couldn't get.
And that was particularly because of the hypothermia protocol, right? Because they couldn't really evaluate his brain as long as he was in that state. So there was this crucial piece of information that was missing the entire time.
Yeah. So because he was hypothermic, because he was ventilated, he had to be sedated. And so he's on these, deep sedatives. He's on heavy doses of opioids because they broke all of his ribs. So if he can feel anything, they don't want him to be in pain. So yeah, he's going to have to be. We always said we would tease him if he ever came back. We had to thaw him out. Had to thaw the popsicle out. And then they'd be able to do an accurate EEG to try to see what's going on with his brain. So I get EEG? Yes,
Yeah,
EEG. That's
EEG.
yes,
Yeah.
electro. Yes,
Yeah.
not a real doctor. So we knew that we wouldn't get that information until they could take him off the sedatives and see what was going on with his brain. Um, and so again, we have to work towards the moment where we could get the piece of information, but getting that piece of information looked an awful lot like trying to bring him back, right? And and so if we got to the point where we could get a good EEG and it says that he had catastrophic brain damage, but now he's breathing on his own. Well, now we're really in trouble because now it turns out we've done exactly the thing he told us not to do. And we couldn't know that until we got to the end, right?
Yeah. Oh, I think this dilemma really describes a lot of these tricky end of life situations, particularly in the ICU when we just don't have all the answers. And that's what stood out is how many of the doctors you worked with could not tell you anything that would have helped you with the decision. They all wavered on prognosis or even to advise you about what to do. And it seemed like even the ICU attending said no to a DNR order or didn't advise that.
Yeah, the attending was really kind of gruff with us. And I think it's because to him, it felt like we were asking about a DNR out of nowhere because, this is like day 3 and he's not gotten any worse. And so all of a sudden, he comes in and we get to see him like 3 minutes a day. And so my sister and I had been awake for 70 hours and crying and trying to figure this out. And so, yeah, the big question for us is, well, if he codes again, what happens? And it feels really problematic to us to revive him again, given that if he codes, the situation doesn't look like it's improving, right? So we started the conversation about DNR, and we asked the attending, and he just was visibly surprised. No, what? Why? No, we're not there yet. We're still learning. And I was like, yeah, but learning is action, right? Like the train is getting further down the station. So we did find a clinician, hero, which was the hospital neurologist. And I don't remember exactly what day he came in, but it felt late. We didn't get to meet him until days into the vigil around the clock. And he was fantastic. I hope every hospital has someone like him because when he came in, he sat with us for, I don't know, 40 minutes, an hour, and and he explained what happened to his brain. Well, what happens to a brain when you code. And he took into account that Robin is a career nurse who started CPR right as soon as he hit the floor. And so he told us everything that could happen, likely happen. And then when we said, all right, here's our dad, here's how he's talked to us our whole life, here are his wishes, can you help us think through the practical matter of what to do? When you ask that sort of question to a lot of physicians, they really shy away. And he was just very comfortable. He said, look, you're asking me whether you should sign a DNR. It sounds to me like, given your dad's wishes, that's a pretty good idea. If he codes again, the situation's getting better, not worse. He probably doesn't want to come back from that. And that was just like this massive amount of relief because we finally got someone to at least start to give us a piece of that information, right? So he still was the one saying, I'm not going to get the EEG to read until he's out of sedation, and this is going to be the weekend or something. But also, yes, you're right to be worried, right? Like,
Yeah, and you wrote that he gave you two plausible scenarios and one possible scenario. Possible, though not very likely. But that to me sounds so helpful to at least give you those bearings of here's a way to look at what might happen in the future. And it sounds like that's the first time you actually came out of total confusion in a way about where are we and what's going on here.
yeah, since nobody wanted to talk about prognosis, he was the first one to say, it's possible that he wakes up and within a few months of therapy, maybe speech therapy, maybe just physical therapy, but he more or less returns to himself. That's possible because Robin was by his side and he had good CPR. But look, it's really hard to perfuse blood all the way to the brain for 20 minutes. And so more likely scenarios, never wakes up. That's the one he seemed to think was most likely. Or he wakes up, but he's severely brain damaged. And he knew that was the one that we were most afraid of because of his expressed wishes. So yeah, that was the situation kind of once we got a little bit of clarity. Um, I mean, the really striking thing is the whole process of trying to to get him warmed up so they can wean him off the medication so that they can get an EEG. That took most of the week, and what I didn't have space for in the essay was to talk about the complications with the EEG. That the first one that the neurologist got, he came in and said, it looks like our worries were reasonable. The EEG's a mess. It looks like he's having global seizures.
Mm.
It it doesn't look like anybody's home, right? They're warming him up, which was a very distressing process to watch. Try to get him off some of this medication. He's very shivering, very cold, but not reactive at all. And so there was one more idea he had. He said, looks like he's having global seizures. It doesn't look like he's coming back, but maybe the seizures are controllable. And if we put him on medication to control them, we'll get a better picture of what damage is actually permanent. And so you put him on that medication to kind of get a sense. But that was the moment, like, given the way he gave us that information, my sister and I were kind of like, it's time to make plans for letting dad go. So we actually went home. We have our families at home. It was my daughter's birthday, which was awful. So to try to think about that, and so we kind of said we need a weekend with our families to gather ourselves. And so she went to Indiana, I went to Maryland, and the day after we got home, because he had started the medication to get a new EEG, got home Friday night or Saturday night, whatever it was. And the next day, took my daughter to the ice rink for her birthday. And I was standing at the ice rink, and my phone rang. And I picked it up, and it was my sister, and she was an absolute mess. And I couldn't tell, I didn't know which direction this was going, right? And she said, "It's dad. He's effing talking." I don't know if you want me to curse on your podcast. and I was so confused. It's one of those moments where her words were clear, but my brain couldn't process what that would possibly mean.
Because it seems impossible. There's no way that actually could happen.
It's absolutely impossible. We had just left like 40 hours ago or something, and they put him on this medication, and they were going to try ventilator weaning trials, right? It's like, we actually thought there was a possibility that he would die from the trials before we even got back, but we had a return trip planned because there was going to be a lot to do, kind of no matter what the situation was. And instead she says he's awake and he's talking, and I can't process it. So she said, listen, and sent me, I think through Facebook Messenger, an audio file that she had recorded. And I can remember as if it were yesterday, the file was my dad, this voice I'd known for my whole life, really, really groggy, sounding like he's drunk or something, but saying, "Yeah, that's Michael. That's Robin's son." And I was I'm thinking about the actual sound of his voice, and so it's really affecting me. But it was like absolute madness to hear, because we had prepared ourselves emotionally for him to be dying this weekend, and he was talking about Michael. So we bought plane tickets and went right back to San Antonio.
And you went for these emotional extremes in such a short amount of time. I'm sure it must have been bewildering and confusing in a way, to even believe that this was happening.
Yeah, it was unbelievable and incredibly confusing. Um, it turned out that there was kind of so much going on. We didn't have a full sense, right? Because then, so I'm at the ice rink, and I hang up with my sister and go to the airlines to buy return tickets for the next morning, and desperate to get down there. We don't want him awake without us at his bed, right? And so it's all just like we're texting constantly with Robin, and Michael's Robin's son, trying to get a sense of what's going on and what are his needs, and is he talking enough? Can they really see if he's there? And and all the news sounds good, because it all is like, yeah, I mean, he recognizes all of us. He's saying complete sentences. Obviously, he's in and out of consciousness because the sedation takes a long time to wear off, especially when you've been deeply sedated for over a week like that. But he seems there. Um, so it wasn't until we landed in San Antonio that Michael picks us up from the airport and gives us the first warning, like, just so you know, your dad's not quite himself, right?
Mm.
Um, and it was a weird sort of whiplash. So actually, after I wrote the essay, I sent it to the whole family to make sure they were okay with it. They also had to like fact check my memory, right? Um, but Michael called me and said, it never occurred to me how blindsided you must have been when you showed up because there was so much going on, so much information to convey. But when I read it, I realized that must have been really hard. And so, yeah, he was like, look, your dad is hallucinating. Uh, he's trying to leave. He's trying to stand up whenever possible. And of course, he's connected to a dozen machines and a fall risk for sure. Um, and yeah, so there's something going on, but he's coherent. Uh, so it's a very interesting situation. So that's the sort of like prep we got before we got back to the hospital. So we walk into his room, um, and another moment that I will never forget is walk in. He's awake. He's talking to Robin. He sees us. We all just immediately burst into tears. I go to one side of his bed. My sister goes to another. She's kissing his head, and he's trying to hold on to both of us, and he's just bawling. Um, and it's this incredible joy combined with some weirdness because like as he gets emotional he squirms, so he kind of like rubs his legs together and rocks back and forth, and um and so we kind of have to all settle down before I can get a sense of what's going on, but he is clearly uncomfortable and there's something neurological going on somewhere, and at the time I didn't have a good sense of what it was, but so you had this squirming, you had this sort of weirdness, and then very quickly we saw the hallucinations. He saw mice running across the floor. He saw flies. Flies would be in part of his room, and he'd get really incensed that we didn't believe him that there were flies there. Um, and he would try to stand up all the time whenever he got bored. So that was the next sort of kind of crisis moment for us because we got back and we didn't know whether we had done the exact thing he asked us not to do. Right.
Yes, exactly. He was awake, but that wasn't the only issue since he didn't appear to be himself.
Yeah. And it's, again, like I don't want to not be myself is this very vague wish. And so now he wakes up and he remembers us and he's happy. And like one of the first things he says is, there's so much I want to do with my life. We have to do it now. We have to go on a cruise together. Like he's not only recognized, like he's coherent, he's planning. So there's some sense in which he clearly woke up himself. And then there's also something clearly wrong. And so does that count as not waking up as himself?
Hmm. And it sounds like he was aware that he came close to death. Like he had some sense of that something very significant had happened.
Yeah, and what's interesting is for the following, I'm going to say month, um, he would have to relearn some of that. So he didn't kind of newly forget memories, but so yes, when he first woke up, they explained the whole situation to him, and he was like, "Holy cow, I almost died. That's crazy." Um, but a couple weeks later, he didn't remember waking up. Right,
Hmm.
so later, that last 2 weeks had been erased. He still remembered because it was everyday conversation that he'd almost died. He was in the hospital. He eventually had to get uh, so not just a pacemaker, but they implanted a defibrillator because they didn't want the same thing to happen again, right? So if his heart stops, he'll be defibrillated again. So he had to stay in the hospital for that surgery. So like all of this is going on. He always knows that he almost died, but then a month later, he's home, and I get to go back and visit him during a work trip. And now he doesn't remember any of his time in the hospital, right? So like the amnesia kind of grows the longer he's awake, um, which isn't so surprising to me. I've had my own traumatic injury. Like I understand kind of the way, like the further you get from it, you get like a border around how much you forget. But it definitely took him, when I talk to him now, he doesn't even remember the conversations we had kind of once we got moved out, moved home, and I wanted to kind of ask him about, his whole experience. He was quite coherent by then, and we had long, meaningful conversations, but he doesn't remember that either. So yeah, he knew something bad had happened, but he kind of continually learned over the next, I don't know, month or so, however long it took.
At this point, did you still feel some confusion or in some way unsettled about the way all of this had unfolded and about your decisions? Well, you didn't even really get to make many decisions in that process, but the way it unfolded and honoring your father's wishes or not.
Deep, deep confusion. So, when he wakes up and there's something clearly wrong, I'm desperate to know what it is, because if that's permanent, well, now we've got all of the guilt, right? This is what he told us not to do. And so Robin, who's been there the whole time, says, look, the attending says it's just ICU delirium. I see it in the hospital all the time. Like, we just need to get him reacclimatized to the world. We need to get him on a day night cycle. He's got to get the sedatives out of his system. Um, and so everybody around us kind of believed that all of the stuff that was going on was a result of ICU delirium. Um, I was really interested in this sort of squirming and discomfort and insomnia that came with it, because we mentioned at the very beginning of the conversation, I have this section of work that I do on opioids and drugs, and so I'm very intimately familiar with withdrawal, and it sure looked to me like he was in withdrawal, which wouldn't be surprising. He was on a continuous fentanyl drip for a week, not to mention the benzos, right? And so there was a lot going on neurologically. His brain had kind of been soaked for a good while in a lot, and so everybody seemed confident that it would resolve, and the doctors didn't seem very uncomfortable, but I was deeply, deeply uncomfortable because I needed to know that this wasn't his new normal and that we didn't do the worst thing to him. Yeah.
And that entire time, you were still uncertain, like still in a place of not really knowing what the ultimate outcome would be, and just having to live with all those questions and all of that discomfort.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's exactly right. So we eventually, he's in the ICU for another however many long, week or so. And that's actually when it got the hardest, because when he was comatose, we could go home and get sleep, and Robin didn't. But my sister and I would go to her house, and we would get some reasonable amount of rest each night, or at least lay down each night. I'll never forget that New Year's Eve was one of those nights. Went and bought a bottle of whiskey and opened my father's will on New Year's Eve, is what my sister and I did to try to do some planning. That part was relatively easy in terms of the vigil, because then once he was awake, he didn't sleep for days
Mm.
because of this withdrawal, delirium stuff that was going on. And if he was left alone, he'd try to stand up. And so somebody had to be with him, and we would take shifts basically, but if no one had been there to be with him, they would have had to restrain him, which just sounds like the most awful possible way to try to get over this process. So that week was very hard, but it did recede. Like, I'd say after about 3 days where he didn't sleep at all. I can't remember where they ended up tapering some benzodiazepines. They kept wanting to try different things, and we were torn about whether to let them remedicate him or if that might prolong the agony. So I don't actually remember exactly how it resolved, if it just timed out or if we gave him a benzo taper. But after those first 3 days, he finally started getting little bits of sleep, started to regulate the day-night cycle, the hallucinations started lessening. And so by the time he was healthy enough to be taken out of the ICU into, I think it was a step down floor before his surgery, um, he was, we were feeling much more comfortable that all of that really was transient, right? That he was coming back. Um, but it was a nightmare. That week once he was awake was pretty torturous. Yeah.
And it seems to me from looking at it that his recovery was so against the odds that the chances of that happening are so very slim that it does kind of defy our belief system in a way, but and it even defies the whole medical system attempts to make prognoses and outline possibilities for families, because sometimes things happen that we don't expect at all.
I mean, so again, as an ethicist, like this was part of it. It took me over a year to publish the essay that you read that led to this conversation. And a part of that was I didn't know, I felt like I learned something important that I wanted to share, but I didn't know how to share that in a responsible way. Because here's a lesson that someone could have taken that would have been heartbreaking to me if they did. Oh, look, this could always happen. So hold out hope, aggressive life preservation at all costs, because you might get lucky. If if that were the message anyone took away from this, then I wouldn't have published it, because that was so not the experience, right? When we finally got to go home, so after he had his surgery, the pacemaker and defibrillator were installed. He had recovered enough that we got to go back to Robin's house. We had this a few days before I had to leave, where his conscious periods got a little bit longer, because he slept a lot, especially from the seizure medication, right? So those global seizures had to be medicated to wake him up, and so they had to be medicated for many months into the future. And so I would wait until he had these like peak moments between naps, and finally, sitting outside one day on the deck, I said, "Dad, you understand how badly off you were, right?" And he kind of recounted and said, "Well, yeah, it looks like there was a good chance I was never coming back, and that if I did come back, I might have been a vegetable. I might have been, been on some spectrum of brain damage." He made it clear, and I said, "Okay, he knows." I said, "So you told Sis and I our whole lives that we better never impose life on you if you're not yourself, and then if we do, you're gonna die eventually, and then come back and haunt us." Um, and so we took a big risk, right? We let them keep doing these things to you with the hope that this would happen, but with the recognition that this was incredibly unlikely. Did we do okay? And he was quiet for a long time, which is not my father's way. Another change. He was quiet for a long time, and finally he said, maybe this is one of those cases where you just do the best you can, and there's no blueprint, there's no obviously right answer, and if you'd done it and I had lost, that would have been terrible for everybody, but I won, and I'm really, really glad to be here. And maybe that's just the best you can do in these cases. And that's the conversation that made me want to write the essay, because I haven't gotten any further than that in my thinking. Like the way he described it, I don't have any more ethics advice to give anyone who finds themselves in this position, right? You act in good faith and you try your best to be a conduit for the person you love, knowing full well that you might lose and hope that you win. And we just got insanely lucky. And that's really all, that's the entirety of the analysis I can give, which is so disheartening to me.
Although I think it's so valuable, just that point of you do the best you can in the moment, given whatever the circumstances are that you find yourselves in. And as you said, the train had already left the station by the time you and your sister arrived. You couldn't undo the choices that had been made the night before. So that was the situation you were in, that you had to accept. And, and you, every moment along the way, you kept doing what seemed right for the moment, even if it felt like, I'm not sure this is really what dad would want or not. I don't know. But you just keep doing what you think is the best thing. And I think that's really what it comes down to so often. And I feel like in some ways creating I think I'm not saying, I think it's very important that we have advanced directives and we do this planning and we think ahead and we know what we want. But what we can't assume is that that means everything will happen the way we want it to, because there are a million different circumstances that could arise that could change the course of everything that's happening. And we have to have a lot of grace and a lot of acceptance for whatever does come up and whatever does happen.
Yeah, I mean it, and we have to be willing to accept that it can lead to really paradoxical situations, so what I have made peace with is that these two things are both true. I am incredibly grateful that things happen in such a way that I get more time with my dad. I am incredibly grateful that this is the way the actual world went. And if I had been there on the first night, I would have said, okay, withdrawal support. And that feels paradoxical. And I just had to make peace with it.
Yeah, because had you been there on the first night, you would have been acting within his wishes as you knew them with the medical information you received. And so the entire point of this conversation is really not in any way to say rethink your decisions, second guess what you should have done. No, but that each one of us with our loved ones and for our loved ones, we're just in the moment where we find ourselves when we have the opportunity or the call to make a decision. We just do the best we can with what we know that moment. And that's exactly what you did. And it just happened that the events played out in such a way. It happened that his girlfriend was a career nurse who was obviously very good at CPR. She, I mean, that's incredible. That doesn't happen for most people.
Yeah. Yeah. No, exactly right. And now so they're married, by the way. So girlfriend, now spouse. But yeah, she gets to hold that over his head the rest of the life. Right? That should entitle you to some, negotiating power in a relationship.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I'm curious, will this change how you teach your students about bioethics around end of life cases? Because I imagined it's the information all seemed kind of cut and dry. It's there, the Karen Ann Quinlan case. Here's what we know, here's what happened. But do you have a different perception of that now?
100%. So, in the second half of the fall, I usually teach my graduate students a kind of spread of topics in bioethics. And I always do end of life because it's just a core piece of biomedical ethics. You do beginning of life, you do end of life. And I typically do one or two of a few different topics. And so, yeah, you might do kind of traditional cases where the doctors and the families disagree on care. You show the kind of historical establishment of the right to refuse treatment by competent patients. but also, I think it's really important to talk about like physician-assisted suicide and euthanasia. So, how are we supposed to think about policy development in these areas? Um, so, I think what I'll add this year is I'll add a discussion of uncertainty at the end of life, because it never would have occurred to me that that would be such a huge ethical component. But I also very often teach clinicians. So clinicians are in my graduate program sometimes, but then also sometimes they're getting an MPH and they just take a course and with me just as one of their electives. And so this year I have two palliative care doctors in my program. I have two other clinicians, different expertise, and so you have really great perspectives when different people in the room can talk about being a family member in this case, being a physician in this case, being a nurse in this case. And I very often have representatives from these different parties in my classrooms. Um, so it's humbling in a way to think that in the past I've probably had those voices in each of my classes, and we never got to that conversation of nuance and uncertainty and just the complexity and challenges. So I will definitely be doing that this year. Yeah.
And I was wondering, given that, I mean, you were in this, the most challenging situation that I can imagine in the ICU, but are there things that some of the doctors you interacted with before the neurologist finally came and clarified things? Are there things that those doctors could have handled differently or done better? Are there, I mean, looking back in retrospect, would you say that?
Yes, for sure. It's so hard to know how to give this sort of advice because I understand the challenges of the ICU. Our healthcare system is a mess in a lot of ways, and so the kind of fragmentation in the really highly medicalized space of the ICU makes all of these handoffs really weird, right? You know, these different specialists all coming in and not necessarily talking to one another. But the thing that I found most frustrating and really borderline offensive was not taking seriously how hard the decision making process was for us, because they didn't see there being any decisions to be made, right? Like each one of them was just like, he's alive, another day, right? Check his urine, see if we need to titrate any medicine differently. And like all of the decisions were like medication decisions. And they didn't understand that we were wrestling with the end of his life potentially. Like we were in an end of life decision making space, even if they didn't see us there yet. Like this was all part of our end of life story. And that was really frustrating to not have them acknowledge it, because it made us feel like we were just passengers, right? They're all driving the train and they'll occasionally let us know what's happening. Yeah.
Yeah, and that they weren't even looking at the same scenery outside the train as you were seeing in a way. It does occur to me that medicine itself doesn't do uncertainty very well, that medicine is all about grasping a hold of any kind of certainty or tangible information we can find, like the numbers today. Oh, look, this was better than 1 point better than yesterday. That's good. And the medicine doesn't handle uncertainties. And yet, think of how many situations involve uncertainties, many in addition to what you went through in the ICU. And we're really failing people by not being able to be good companions for them through that journey and supporting them. Even I think even if they had said this is a really tough time because we don't quite know what's coming next, and we understand this is hard on you, that alone probably would have made a huge difference.
Yeah, for sure. Just a little acknowledgement and a little bit of space to be heard. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So one of the points of us having this conversation, I had the very same concerns you did. Is I don't want to be presenting a story that's held out there as, oh, don't don't ever take anyone off of life support, or don't ever say no to resuscitation because this miracle could happen. I don't want to convey that message or meaning at all. Only that again, you make the best decisions that you can, but also those of us who are support people, who are trying to help families in these situations, there are things we could do a better job of to recognize the dilemma that's going on, the conflicts in your mind, the confusion that you feel in the midst of all this uncertainty. And I love hearing the story of the one neurologist who actually he just made it so clear, and how that simplified everything and made it fall in place for you.
Yeah, I just to have somebody able and willing to spend the time hearing us, teaching us, talking with us. Um, I'm I'm sure our healthcare system doesn't make it easy to have those spaces, right? He spent like an hour with us. And that's, yeah, that's not something that we're good at, but man, it made a world of difference. Yeah.
Well, I'm thinking of the good that has come from this situation for all the students that you're teaching. Just for having written that essay, I can't imagine how many people have read it and have reconsidered some things. And that's what I did. I stumbled across it and then thought, oh, we need to talk about this. This is such an important subject. So I'm really grateful for your willingness to just be open and vulnerable and tell us the story and the story of your dad. So
Well,
thank you.
yeah, well, thank you for that. That's really nice to hear. As you can imagine, it's not the easiest thing to write or to talk about. So it helps to hear that. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I'm grateful to you. We're out of time, but I'd love to hear more someday about your book, which is In Pain, a Bioethicist's Personal Struggle with Opioids, which also sounds very important. And I will say you're an excellent writer. And so that's one of the reasons I enjoyed reading the piece that you wrote. So I know I would enjoy your book as well. So I'll just mention it again so people can go to travisrieder.com, Rieder spelled Rieder, to learn more about the book. And is there a link to this essay on your website also?
You know what? I might not have updated it with that, but now you're reminding me I will.
Okay, and I'll leave a link in the show notes too, because everyone should read it for themselves. And having heard you tell the story, it will be even more impressive. Well, thank you again, Travis. It's been a real pleasure to talk with you.
Well, thank you for having me.
I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Travis Rieder and found it thought provoking as I did. I really appreciated his vulnerability and honesty in telling this very personal story about his father and the dilemma he and his entire family faced during their healthcare crisis. I think it's a really good reminder for us to look at cases like this in order to understand that life itself is messy and crisis situations are often not straightforward or easy to navigate. And this situation at the outset appeared to be an end of life situation. And for the most part, most of us, if we're healthcare proxies, may find us in a situation where it truly is the end of life, and we may be stepping in to try to help make decisions for a loved one. And it could be, as happened for Travis, that a decision has already been made in the moment before we even arrive on the scene that dictates how things move forward. And as Travis said, he felt as if the train had already left the station. It was hard to come in after his father had been put on the ventilator and make a choice at that moment whether or not to remove the ventilator. Even though he knew his father's wishes very well, he fully understood exactly what his father would want. I think this is an instructive tale for all of us as well, who may be the patient one day. And it's very possible that no matter how carefully we outline our end of life wishes and how we talk about them and let everyone know and put them in writing and have legal documents to protect our wishes, it's very possible, like his father, we could end up in a situation, because it's complicated and because crises happen without warning, we could also end up on a ventilator or in a place that we had hoped we would not be. In his father's case, of course, miraculously, the outcome was not what we would normally expect. His father survived and is perfectly fine now after that healthcare crisis. And so that was amazing. And it does feel like a miracle to me. But that's not the typical outcome of a situation like this. And we know that to be true. That once someone is placed on a ventilator, most often they do not wake up, they do not recover. And I think the three scenarios the neurologist outlined for Travis and his family are very realistic. That his father, number one, may not survive coming off the ventilator. Number two, may survive but may have significant brain damage. Or number three, could potentially, rarely wake up and recover, which is what happened. Once again, it's outside the norm. It's amazing that was the outcome of this story. But we shouldn't focus on that. We need to focus on the fact that sometimes the way situations unfold, our wishes are not met or followed in the moment of a crisis. And that's because the healthcare proxy isn't on the scene, because medical personnel and emergency responders are doing the best they can, making the best choice they can in the moment with limited information. So I think we have to prepare ourselves that, yes, we all need to have advance directives. We all need to think through our wishes and what we want. We need to put them in writing, talk to our loved ones, talk to our doctors, do as much as we can to ensure that our wishes are known. But then we also have to let go of the outcome a bit and understand it's possible that things just won't work out the way I would like them to. And the other aspect of the situation with Travis's father is that they didn't have all of the information at the time these decisions were being made, because they did not yet know the condition of his brain. So they weren't certain what might happen when they thawed him out, so to speak, and took him off the ventilator. They didn't really know for sure. And in times of uncertainty, I think sometimes it's best to err on the side of caution and to take care, but who's to say and who knows? And honestly, we can't predict or foresee every possible thing that could happen to us in the future. So we can't have plan A and plan B for every situation that's out there. We simply have to trust that the people who love us and care for us will do their best to make their best choices in the moment, which is what Travis and I concluded together, that from moment to moment, you simply do the best you can with whatever information you have, and you greet the moment with grace, and you extend grace to yourself, because if you're the decision maker, it's a huge amount of pressure to try to do the right thing. And as Travis expressed, that's what he cared about, was doing the right thing, the best thing. And because he took that decision making on himself with that attitude, it absolutely was the right thing. And even if it had a different outcome, it would have been the right thing, the way things unfolded and proceeded. So again, this was a tricky case, not common, not one that most of us will face, at least with the outcome that this story had. But I think it's good for us to think things through and to be realistic about how healthcare crises actually happen and the moment-to-moment decision-making that happens, and to understand in this messy, chaotic, crazy time, things may not roll out the way we wish they would, but ultimately it will be okay one way or another. And I think it's a good message to give to our loved ones, those who might be our decision makers one day, to say, you know what, I trust you to do the best you can with the information you have in the moment. I trust you. I know you love me. I know you know what I want. but I also know that you may have to make difficult choices, and I trust your judgment. I think it's really nice if we could free up our loved ones from some of the blame and guilt that can go along with this kind of decision making. If we could relieve that in advance by letting them know, do your best, and I love you, and it will be okay. So that was the message I really wanted to get across by sharing Travis's story with you. And I'm so grateful to him for being willing to come on and talk to us. So do remember that you can go to the website for this podcast at eolupodcast.com. You can view the show notes for this episode, but also all of the archives, all the back episodes that are listed on there have show notes and links and helpful information for you. So check out that website if you'd like to know more. Also, be sure to share this content with other people if you think it could help someone that you know. Tell them about the podcast and show them how to subscribe. If you yourself haven't subscribed, be sure to do that on whatever platform you happen to listen. And if you're so inclined, leave a rating and review because that's very helpful to the podcast. I also, once again, appreciate all the supporters who are making contributions one way or another on Patreon, buying me a coffee or making a PayPal donation. I so appreciate you. You keep me going from week to week, and it means everything to me. So thank you once again. And you can go to eoluniversity.com/support if you'd like to know how you can join the team and make a contribution. So until we're together next week, when I'll be back with another interview, remember that we're here for love. When it comes right down to it, no matter what decisions you have to make, love is the right answer always. And so let love be the driving force behind your choices, and face your fear. Be ready for whatever life brings you next, and love each and every moment of your very precious life. Bye-bye.